The Quest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to this episode of the Quest Podcast with me, Danny Lawler. If you're new to the Quest Podcast, do hit like and subscribe. Feel free to share with your friends too. So this is the last episode of the winter 2024 season of the Quest Podcast, and we're determined to leave you on a high. So the guest for this episode is Jennifer Geary. Jennifer is an experienced financial services professional, an author, and also, since quite recently, a podcaster. So do check out her podcast, the C-Suite Framework Podcast, on your preferred podcast platform. Our conversation focuses on the first of Jenny's books, How to Be a Chief Operating Officer. I was delighted when Jenny said she could come on the show because the COO role is one which is incredibly important, but kind of ill-defined and one that people don't really know that much about. So I wanted to get Jenny's take on what it is that the role involves, what it doesn't involve, how people who carry it out well go about doing that, and what are the pitfalls where it can go wrong. She has described this COO role as a thankless job, and I was interested to find out what she means by that. So with great thanks to Jenny for coming on the podcast, sit back, relax, and enjoy this, the last episode of 2024.
The Quest Podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.
Hi, Jennifer. You're very welcome to the Quest Podcast. Thanks very much for joining me on the show.
Hi there, Daniel. Great to be here.
I understand you're launching into the world of podcasting yourself. Tell us a little bit about the C-Suite Framework Podcast.
Yeah, it's, I guess, another way to reach people and to go a little bit deeper on all of the topics that I've picked up over the years as I've written my books. So, I've written, we can get into it in a while, but, I've written 5 business books on various C-suite roles and over 7 years, and met some incredible people, both in those 7 years and over the course of my career. And there's almost never enough time or enough paper to really plumb the depths of all of their knowledge. And so I really enjoy the podcast and conversational format. And so the concept is just, I've got an initial shortlist of about 30 people, really smart, engaging people who I find fascinating, who I just wanted to have a longer conversation with, and one by one going through those. So there are topics, everything from strategy. My first podcast was with Dr. Max McKeown, who wrote the best-selling strategy book in the world. And he's really entertaining and really interesting. But I'll cover everything from sustainability, supply chain, legal technology, cybersecurity, AI, kind of whatever I want to talk about, which is really enjoyable, of course, but all useful, I think, to C-suite members. So it's called the C-Suite Framework. And obviously, after they listen to your one, Daniel, it would be great if they could listen to mine.
Glad you got that in before I did, Jenny. And available from all good podcast platforms, I assume.
Absolutely, yeah, the usual. Apple, Spotify, you'll find me there.
So I know your first book was around how to be a chief operating officer, and there's been a suite of books since then.
Yes.
Is the COO role still the one that you get asked the most about? Is it still the one that, because I guess it feels like the one that's the least obviously defined?
It is. The first book that I wrote, it's kind of my flagship product. It's the one that people talk to me more about than all the others. And I think you're right. I think it's a combination of, first of all, it's, usually the second most senior role in the organization, and still shockingly ill-defined and not that well spoken about and not that well written about. And obviously that was the genesis for me writing the book 7 years ago. In my first COO role, not only was I grappling with a breadth of functional areas that I needed to have at least a working knowledge of, I was creating my role and defining it and saying, well, look, I think it's this. And after I, dug really deep and learned the individual functional areas along the way, I guess I wanted to put something out into the world and say, look, this is what I think the role is. This has been my experience of it. And please disagree with me, and over the years people have come back to me and said, well, look, I have responsibility for R&D in my role and you didn't cover that. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Or people have come back to me and said, well, look, I don't have finance or I don't have HR. But broadly, I think over 7 years and 30,000 book sales, it has stood up pretty well to scrutiny. And of course it's an evolving feast, but no two COO roles are the same. And one of the first things I think you have to do as a COO is to define what that role is going to mean in your unique context.
I used to have a colleague, and he said that his role was he was the office at the end of the corridor. So he was kind of where you went if you couldn't find anyone else to do something or answer the question. He was the one who took on the stuff that didn't have an obvious home. And the COO role has kind of got that air about it because you meant, some of the functions you mentioned there, like let's say legal or people or those types of tasks, you may have an organization that has a dedicated division for that. And if you don't, then maybe it ends up in the room at the end of the corridor, which is the COO. So I guess that's why it can vary from organization to organization, depending on what other capabilities are there.
Yeah, but I suppose which sounds like a really, I don't know, derivative way to speak about the role, doesn't it? That it's sort of the catch-all that nobody else wants to do. And I think if you're not deliberate about it, it can become that. And sure, part of the reason that you're there, particularly in smaller organizations, you do have to be a little bit of a jack of all trades, and you do need to cover a whole bunch of things from, something not working in the building to dealing with a strategic issue or talking to a regulator or so on. But I would always encourage people in a COO role to consciously go and define that, and to say, look, I think it is this, but it's not that. And you do that by looking at, first of all, you start with the CEO that you have in place and what their unique skills and preferences are. So are they a very sort of public facing, do they do the PR, the marketing, the sales? Do they like being out front and having you take care of things back on the ranch, as it were? Are they comfortable dealing with people? Are they comfortable dealing with numbers? And so, your role in a way is to be the foil, the compensation, the kind of support to that CEO. But also, obviously, it depends on the nature of your organization, whether it's regulated, who it's regulated by, what stage of growth it's at. Is it in sort of early stage, rapid growth? Is it stabilizing? Is it in retrenchment? Is it in consolidation? And so, and that's why I say, no two roles are ever alike. And I would personally far rather go out there consciously and say, look, I think this is the role. And obviously, we'll come to this in regulated sectors. You really do have to say, this is the role and this is what I'm responsible for. And that's not to say that there won't be some catch-all tasks at the end of the day that you need to do, but at least you're on a more solid footing.
Yeah, and I think that discipline of describing a role profile or putting parameters around what you do, particularly for something like a COO role where the potential is that it could be very, very broad. But that discipline, instead of putting the rules around it, is important as we move more into, particularly for regulated firms. Here in the UK, you've got the senior manager certification regime. In Ireland, we've got the senior executive accountability regime that applies to some businesses and will apply to all in due course. And does put a big focus on individuals being responsible for certain tasks. So you have to have that discipline around documenting exactly what tasks fall to each of the roles, but particularly the COO, so that they know what is expected of them on those tasks. And if something would go wrong, they understand that they are the port of call for the business or for the regulator to answer for any issues or failings.
Absolutely. And having held SMF positions, I can tell you it does focus the mind. When you're sitting in an executive meeting and you're talking about the rights or wrongs of launching a product or, how you promote something or, if you're the one where you say, well, actually, at the end of the day, it's going to come back to me if this is wrong. These regimes were designed to do exactly that, to make you think, oh, wow, it's on me wait a second, really, am I happy about this? Let me take one more look. And also, you may have an executive committee, you may have a group of people who have opinions on things, but ultimately, if you're that person who the accountability will come back to, yours is the ultimate voice. Yours is the ultimate yes or no. And I have been in positions holding an SMF function, rarely, in fairness, but it has happened where all eyes in the room have turned to me and said, Jenny, are you happy? And I've had to say, yes, I am, or no, I'm not. And including one time when I had to be the sole person to say, no, we're not quite ready. There's one more thing we need to do. I need to get this area covered off before I say yes. So in that way, I think the regime does do what it's meant to do. And I definitely found it focused the mind for me.
Which is exactly what it's meant to do, right?
Yeah.
Focus that mind and make you say no where maybe in other circumstances you would have said yes or not yet.
Or gone along with it, or gone along with the general opinion. Yeah.
You've described the COO role as a thankless role. What do you mean by that?
I think when things go well, people go, oh, well, yeah, sure, of course, it's supposed to go like that. And when things go badly, you are more often than not the person who's got to go and clean it up and fix it. So, it's not necessarily a role, I think, for people who like the glory. It's very often the one where you're in the background fixing the issue, making things happen, looking at the details to make sure that sort of all the cogs turn properly. So yeah, I don't especially find it. And by the way, I'm fine with that. I'm very happy to work in the background and, let other people be out front and, talking about things. But I think that's an important character trait, the front facing roles as well. But I think to be a COO, you've got to be happy to be in the background, working the details and making sure that everything is operating as it should.
So is there a personality type or a mindset that is better suited to a COO role than a different role?
I think so. And I talk about that in my book a little bit. I talk about the character traits of the OOs. And, so for example, I think you have to be interested in systems. And what I mean by that is, you have to have that looking at that ability to look at something and to say, oh, wouldn't it be better if it was like this? So I can be standing in a queue outside a chip shop and going, if they had two queues, it would go faster. I just have that in me, that sort of wanting to hack a system and wanting to make it better. I think you have to have resilience. So, projects can take a long time. There can be a lot of failure before there's success, and you've got to be sort of dogged and tenacious and able to carry on. You've got to be focused on execution, on making things happen, not just nice strategic vision and ideas, but you've got to actually put those things into practice. And you've got to be a generalist, right? You've got to have at least a little bit of knowledge about a lot of things.
Yeah, and that generalist versus, the subject matter expert is always a tricky balance. You see it a lot in professional services firms, say, where a lawyer might be excellent with reviewing agreements, but you move up the ranks, the next thing you're head of department and you're not looking at agreements anymore. You're managing people and you're managing a department and you're hitting budgets and you're doing BD. And that move from specialist to generalist can be a real challenge and not necessarily have have individuals that are built that way. Is there a way that organizations who bring someone into or through the ranks for a COO role, is there a way to prepare for that better so that you can kind of manage that generally?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, the irony about people who get promoted into these, and not just COO, I would say C-suite positions in general, is that you probably got there because you were really excellent at that thing that you do, right? So you might have been, an excellent finance professional, or, as you say, an excellent lawyer, or, excellent in operations. And in taking on that senior role, you actually have to let go of some of the stuff that you used to absolutely love doing, because somebody else is doing that job now. And your role is to sit around a table of people who have different agendas to you. So the chief marketing officer, the chief revenue officer, the CEO, the lawyer, everyone around the table has a slightly different definition of success to you now. And they expect that you're technical areas will just run and will run excellently, and that operational excellence comes with the role. But then what you have to do is learn about what success means for them and find areas of common ground. So it's not a surprise sometimes that people who are superb in a particular functional line don't always enjoy that transition. In terms of what organizations can do, I think you have to think about that broader generalist skill set, that curiosity, that diplomacy, that ability to work with others, because someone who is brilliant at a functional area may not be brilliant at that generalist area.
And where does stakeholder management play into this then? Because I guess your key stakeholder is probably your CEO, and that's a relationship you need to be very mindful of. And then your other C-suite team members, I guess they're key stakeholders too. Is that something COOs need to be very mindful of?
Yeah, 100%. You're obviously, the relationship with your CEO is paramount, and who does what, and whether they back you up, and whether you have that trust between you and that division of responsibilities that works well. But don't forget also, if you haven't already by that point, you will have an awful lot of scrutiny and time with your board as well, assuming you're organized in that way. But you may have a chair, you'll have a board, you'll have people with different functional expertise who will be asking questions of you in a different way. And that's a skill that takes time to build up also. So yeah, you've got your team beneath you, your senior management team that you're building out around you. You've got, as I say, that group of eclectic individuals around the exco, and your CEO and your board, and then of course external facing. So regulators, stakeholders, shareholders, investors, customers as well.
So let's start with when things go wrong then. So if you've seen situations where just issues have come up or there has been a failing, hopefully smaller rather than bigger, when people reflect on how they got to that situation, is there things that tend to crop up that lead to that failure?
Oh, let me count the ways. We could have a whole podcast on about how and when things go wrong. But I'll give a couple of examples. And interestingly, I'm actually reviewing a book at the moment called Meltdown, about the failure of Credit Suisse. And I've just finished it, and it's a superb read and a kind of an exercise and a case study in how and why things can go wrong. But I'll talk about a couple of examples. So I think first of all, that CEO-CO relationship, that trust relationship, if that's not there, and if people know that there's even a chink of daylight between you and them, that can lead to issues. So I call it the if mum says no, ask dad situation. And that can be really undermining for a COO if people feel that there is that there's a difference, that they can get a different answer from the CEO than you. So that's one to watch for. If people are the wrong fit for a role, and that's not saying that someone is necessarily good or bad, that can be a problem. But if you've got the wrong person for the wrong situation, for the wrong strategy. So for example, a COO who is fantastic in a high growth, quite unstructured environment may not be the right person for a more stable organization. So there's a temporal issue to this as well, and there's an issue of life cycle. So the wrong fit, the wrong match, the wrong strategy. So I start with a couple of foundations in all of my books, and those are culture, strategy, and execution. And if any of those are not working, that's pretty foundational before you get onto some of the more some of the more technical, specific areas. So, if your culture is not positive, not lined up, not cohesive, not authentic, you'll find all of your efforts can be holed below the waterline, and it's like it's like driving with the brakes on. So I always recommend that you start and look at culture and really audit that and see whether it's conducive to success. The strategy, if the strategy is, and as COO, I think you have a really fundamental role to look and check and make sure that your strategy lines up. But if it is not optimized, if it's not appropriately designed, if it's not being executed, that's also not going to work. And the third piece is that execution piece, which is, you may have the best vision in the world. Your CEO may talk, a great story, but if it's not engaging with the rest of the organization, and if words don't translate into deeds, then things can come off the rails. So there are a couple of fundamentals that I look at straight away.
when it's done well, there are things that people do to achieve that. And that's obviously a key feature in the book. So, what are some of those key principles that you see, or those key traits, or those key practices that you see good CEOs engage in to make sure that they're getting the most out of their role?
I mean, I think I sort of I guess I go back to like the way I laid out the book. So I look at those foundations first of all. Look at the role, I look at the match of you to the role, and then I look at those three foundations of culture, strategy, and execution. Then I go through a further 13 technical disciplines, right? So this is where you talk about, supply chain or procurement, facilities, comms, legal, HR, finance, governance. And I go through each of those, and I try to identify what good looks like, what the industry frameworks are that define those areas. And then also to give an indication of red flags and things to watch for, warning signs when things aren't working maybe as well as they might be. And also conversely, when things are going really well, when you've got a high performing division, what you can do to take that performance and elevate it to the next level as well. And I finish up each area with 10 questions, 10 good questions for a COO to ask, for example, the CTO, the head of HR, and so on. And when I created this, I had those questions vetted by, the chief technology officer, the general counsel, the head of sustainability, procurement, whatever. So to say, are these 10 intelligent questions that you would like your COO to ask of you? So, and then I kind of wrap up by looking at things like how to build the team around you, how to complement for the skills that you don't have, how to create a, diverse, high performing team, how to use technology, and then, finally, I think one of the key elements of success for any of these senior roles is once you've done all of that, how do you create time for you to step back and see the wood for the trees and stay focused and ask the bigger questions? Because if it's going well, you should have great people doing great work around you and giving you a little bit of time to just step back and make sure that you're still going in the right direction. You haven't missed anything. There isn't a new black swan emerging. And that's really your value to the organization. If you're too busy, you don't have time to do that.
The Holy Grail. And so at the time that you stepped into your first COO role, there was no How to Be a COO Role book. Hence, you came to write it. But given that you need to know so much about so much of a business to do the COO role, if you're stepping into a new organization directly as COO, how do they get up the learning curve, or is it always a role you nearly have to promote from internally on?
I don't think it's a role that you always have to promote internally. But both, because if you have a broad-based COO with experience in a lot of these disciplines, they're going to bring some of that into a new organization. The first step, obviously, as I say, is to, define what areas you're responsible for and do a very thorough self-audit, I guess, of areas where you have strength and areas where you need some development. So I knew coming to my first role, I had trained as a chartered accountant, so I had the finance and accountancy background. I had led technology projects for a number of years. So while I was by no means a developer or a techie, I was able to speak to those people and ask intelligent questions and structure a program of work properly. I had been chief of staff in the legal area, and I am by no means a lawyer, but at least I felt I knew how to work with and speak to lawyers and get the best out of them. And I had worked in and around through my audit training in risk. So I felt I had, 4 pretty fundamental pillars, which made me, a pretty strong candidate for a role. But in the end, I counted 16 areas that I needed to have at least a working knowledge of. And I spent time, dug deep, spoke to experts, researched, read all around me, but had to do all the individual areas. And what I tried to do then, I guess, was to pull that together into a book. Nobody can be an expert in 16 areas, but the aim, I guess, is to have enough of a working knowledge to know the right questions to ask, to know how to hire great people around you, to be humble and not defensive about hiring people who know more than you about particular areas. You want that, right? You want to get the best supply chain person that you can. You want to get the best compliance person that you can. And then through that symbiosis of you and your skills and those people around you, creating a really solid team.
So one thing I wonder about, Jenny, in Ireland, in regulated firms, the chief operating officer role is what we call a pre-approved control function, a PCF. So it requires the firm, before making the appointment, to go to the central bank and get that appointment cleared and demonstrate that the individual is fit and proper. And so that fitness and probity assessment, if it was somebody involved in the investment side, what I'd like to see what investment experience they have and what qualifications they have, and maybe if it was in compliance, it would be the same. And I just wonder, how would a regulator assess an application for somebody coming in to do a COO role when it really is quite a broad, potentially quite a broad remit? Any thoughts or any hints or tips for our regulator pals out there for what they're looking for when they assess a COO application?
Yeah, and in some of this, you're going to be the expert in this, Daniel, and not me. But in the UK, under the FCA regime, SMF 24 is the COO function, and I think in Ireland it's PCF 42, isn't it? And in the UK, they do specify 7 areas that the COO function may include, but not necessarily be limited to, using that wonderful language. So, they talk about things like business continuity, cybersecurity, information technology, internal operations, operational continuity and resilience, outsourcing, and management of shared services. So in the UK, they do list those 7 areas. My understanding, and correct me if my research it is incomplete here, but they talk about, in Ireland, PCF 42 talks about overall responsibility for managing the internal operations of the firm. But I don't believe that there is a hard mapping of functions. I think that's something that the organization has to do.
Correct. Yeah. If somebody's an MBA, senior executive qualification, that might point that they're a person who is trained for this role, but often people won't do, and they'll have experience in the organization, or they might have done a similar role in a different organization. But it's rare that you would get an exact fit. So you're trying to learn the role as you go. And again, if you're the regulator assessing the appointment in advance, you're saying, well, okay, that looks reasonable that person might be able to step in and do that role.
Yep.
But there
Exactly.
is a bit of a feel,
Exactly. I think as a regulator, I would be looking for an honest and candid assessment of what the role is going to entail. And obviously the experience of the individual, but recognizing that some of those functions may be more critical than others. And obviously you want to see a high degree of matching and experience to the more critical areas. And I would look for a candid assessment of, they have, deep and extensive experience in these areas. They have some experience in those areas. However, see these other roles that we have and this other experience that we have. And, I would hope that honesty, I think, would be rewarded, rather than trying to say so-and-so is an expert in 16 areas.
Yeah. And in my experience working with regulated firms, the central bank and regulators don't tend to be, they tend to gravitate much more to the chief executive officer role, or on the investment side, or on the risk side, or maybe the compliance side. The COO side is a little bit less glamorous, so they don't tend to they don't tend to get the spotlight so much. I guess that would change if you had an operational failure, and next thing you know, you're being shoved forward into the hot seat to answer the questions. But it's an interesting one, because as I said, it's a varied role, that there's not necessarily one skill set. You say, well, I need to see that, or I need to see that qualification for somebody to do that role.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it, that this was the COO role, I think, was one of the more recent additions to the list of PCF functions, maybe recognizing that, how critical it can be, and where we worry hugely about things like data privacy, cybersecurity, operational resilience, of course, with DORA coming in. Maybe that is a recognition that this, an increased recognition of the COO role.
Exactly. And actually, one of the more recent ones, again, is the CIO role, the Chief Information Officer, which back in the early 2010s, when fitness and probity regime kind of came through, the use of technology probably wasn't the same focus as what it is today. So it does evolve. And that's a good thing.
And with that one, if you think about the AI Act in the EU and how, broad-based that is, and, with all the provisions around that, around disclosure, transparency, data, human in the loop, looking for bias, discrimination, model drift, all of those kinds of things, I would expect there to be a lot more attention on that in the coming years as well.
So one last thing then, Jenny, you mentioned that the COO has above all to be very human and self-aware. Is that something more important to a COO than others in the C-suite, or how does that play out for the good COO?
Yeah, and that probably doesn't come up on the on the PCF form, does it? But the why do I say that? The self-awareness, I think, is because of what we've spoken about. A really candid self-assessment of your own personality traits, what you love doing, what you don't love doing, the things that trigger you, the things that your own behavior patterns, because particularly in any leadership role, people look to you more than ever before. And these can be high stress, anxiety inducing roles. Things can go wrong. And I think knowing yourself and knowing your areas of strength and knowing how you like to work, that self-awareness becomes more important than ever in those senior roles. The humanity, I think, is the thing that when things go wrong, when you hopefully have a deposit of goodwill in the bank with your people, and yes, with your regulators as well, where hopefully they have seen you in action. They have seen that you are doing all that you can to do the right thing. They have seen that your intent is good. And I think it's that humanity that, carries people through, and that belief in your good intent that can be really, that can help when things go wrong. So, having the right agenda, doing the right thing, but people seeing who you are and seeing that you're trying to do the right thing, I think is, forges, a slightly deeper relationship and a little more trust.
Yeah, and it is how people perform when things go wrong and the pressure is on. And I've seen it with lawyers advising clients where they're in a difficult situation. That's really where you prove your worth and add your value and show your value. So
exactly right.
That's the proving ground.
Exactly right. That's when you see people's true colors, and you see people at their best and at their worst. Yeah.
That is wonderful, Jenny. I really appreciate that. The COO role, I said, it is a PCF role. It is incredibly important, but it is not one of the ones that necessarily gets a lot of spotlight, and is probably easier than maybe just to kind of fall into it, and a lot of things fall into your role without necessarily that being the right place for them. So it was really great to chat through the detail of that with you and get some insights into how the role can be performed very well. So I really appreciate that, Jenny. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome, Daniel. It's great. I hope it was helpful, and the book is out there, available on Amazon for anyone who might find it useful.
Great. And listen, that wraps up the winter season of the Equest podcast. Thank you very much to everybody for listening. We'll join you again early in 2025 for the next season. Thank you.
The Equest podcast, Funds Industry Conversations.